Hello and welcome to my presentation on Bismarck's foreign policy for TSM Assignment 1. Bismarck's foreign policy is a historical issue which comes under the Humanities module of Teaching Subject Mastery. I chose to do Bismarck's foreign policy because I feel it gives me a strong insight to the background of the rise of a broken Germany. I believe it sees the importance of the rise of Wilhelm I and the importance to the lead-up of World War I. I also didn't have a deep knowledge of Bismarck's influence and what he achieved, so it gave me an opportunity to learn more. It falls under the syllabus topic of later modern Europe and the wider world and is under topic number 2, which is called the Nation States and International Tensions from 1871 to 1920. I would introduce my 5th year class to the senior cycle by beginning with this topic. The overview for Bismarck's foreign policy is very straightforward. I would begin with the unification of Germany and the plan to isolate France. I would then continue to discuss Bismarck's foreign policy. I would begin with discussing the Dreikaiserbund, which is also known as the League of the Three Emperors. I would then go on to talk about the Balkan Crisis, the Triple Alliance, the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 and colonialization. As a history teacher, I would want my students to have a well-rounded knowledge of Bismarck, both from a domestic policy view and a foreign policy view. I would also want my students to have a strong knowledge of the learning outcomes I have outlined here in the presentation. The learning outcomes I would want my students to have by the end of this topic are clear and straightforward. The outcomes aim to help the student do the following: to understand how Bismarck went about planning to isolate France and the unification of Germany, to understand the attempt Bismarck made to make alliances through the Dreikaiserbund, to gain a deeper understanding of the events that took place in the Balkans and how Germany's input had a significant role, to have an insight to Bismarck's Triple Alliance with Austria and Italy and the terms of this alliance, to recognise Bismarck's last attempt maintaining his power in Europe through the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887, and finally to distinguish the colonisation that took place through the scramble for land in Africa and the colonies it had retained during this. As it would be one of the first topics my 5th year students would be covering, I would hope my students would have a fresh approach to this topic. I would want my students to learn about Bismarck and how he paved the way for Wilhelm I to come into power, and I would want my students to be fully educated on what he achieved and what he failed to achieve throughout his foreign policy. My students would have prior knowledge of Bismarck, as before this lesson we would have covered a various amount of topics, including the Second Reich and the changing balancing of power, which would then been followed by the Anglo and Franco-German tensions. We then would have began our studies of Bismarck, starting with his early life and career. We then would have moved on to the state of the German Empire, the culture camp, Bismarck's dislike of the socialists, coercion and conciliation, industrialization and agriculture, and this would all fall under Bismarck's domestic policy. As shown here, we would have looked at maps showing Prussia and then the eventual growth of the German Empire. When discussing the difficulties a history student may have, we have to look to the general difficulties and the one specific to Bismarck's foreign policy, which I have done in the mind map shown. The first two difficulties I have outlined is the problem that most history students possibly face, and that is the amount of different names and different dates in each topic. As a history student, one must have a well-rounded knowledge of key persons and key dates. Along with this problem, especially in Bismarck's foreign policy, we have key persons and place names that are in German, and this may prove difficult to remember for some students, both in pronunciation and spelling. The next problem that history students face when approaching a history topic is sussing the most relevant information. It is important that students have the ability to sort the most relevant information that would be asked in any exam situation, and that could be answered successfully. The final two difficulties that a history student may face is the jump from junior certificate history to leaving certificate history, and in turn, formulating an leaving cert standard essay. As 5th year students, they would need to increase their standard of writing and learning, and at the beginning of 5th year, it would take some time to change this mentality and get into a new way of thinking and learning. In the introductory lesson of Bismarck's foreign policy, I would begin my lesson with the revision from the last topic we would have covered, which would have been Bismarck's domestic policy. I would show my students a quick video from YouTube, which would recap what we have covered so far. I would then give my students a quick worksheet, which would have been based on what was covered in the video and also in the lessons. This activity would take about 10 minutes. I would then begin my Bismarck foreign policy lesson. I would start with the unification of Germany, and I would then continue on to cover the isolation of France, followed by the Dreikaiserbund. I would conclude my lesson by analysing what information my students retained by asking them questions orally in class. This would be for the last 5 minutes of class. I would then give my students homework, but it would be a simple task as they have just done the introduction of this topic, so I would ask my students to write a summary of what they have covered so far. This is the video I would show to my introductory class recapping on the previous lesson. I would play it for 2 minutes and 36 seconds as it has the most relevant information for my class. I have put the link in the references slide below and also in the bio. This is the worksheet I have done out that I would give to my students, and it is only 7 questions long. This would give my students the chance to get engaged in what they have been learning, and the questions are based on what have been covered in previous lessons. Here I have a few examples of questions I would ask at the end of my lesson. These will be asked orally and be based on what was covered in the lesson, and it should take about 5 minutes at the end of my class. When thinking of the strategies that can be used in the classroom, they can be categorized into 3 categories, which I've done in the table above. These are teaching strategies, learning strategies, and assessment strategies. When using teaching strategies, there are a number of different ones that can be used, especially in a history classroom. The teaching strategies that I would use to teach this topic are the following: the traditional way of teaching, analysing newspaper articles from the time of the topic, looking at a timeline of events, analysing documents, both primary and secondary sources, watching documentaries, and researching key persons. When using learning strategies, there are a number of varieties that can be used. The learning strategies I would use are the following: flashcards that can be made for homework, a handout that can be given at the end of every class, planning an essay using the topic sentence format, and finally, analysing exam questions from previous years. When using assessment strategies, I, as a history teacher, must choose the correct ones that will show the students' knowledge growth and prepare them for the eventual Leaving Certificate exam. The assessment strategies I would use are the following: asking open-ended questions at the end of class or during the lesson, giving an exam on the main points, formulating an essay as part of an exam or for homework, giving an exam based on exam questions, doing reflections, and finally oral and written examinations. As a post-primary teacher, it is my responsibility that my students have a well-rounded knowledge and that their key skills are well developed. According to the NCCA, the 5 main key skills for the learner are communications, being personally driven, working with others, critical and creative thinking, and information processing. When teaching this history topic, I would want my students to focus on the following 3 key skills: communication, being personally driven, and information processing. With communications, I would want my students to be able to analyse and interpret texts and any other forms of communication, express opinions, and be able to speculate, discuss, reason, and engage when it comes to a debate or an argument. Also, students should be able to compose and perform in a variety of ways. The next key skill I would want my students to focus on is being personally driven. I would want my students to be able to appraise themselves, evaluate their own performance, and be able to receive and respond to feedback. They should also be able to identify, evaluate, and achieve their own personal goals, and they should be able to be confident and be able to assert themselves as a person. The final key skill I would want my students to focus on is information processing. I would want my students to be able to assess information from a range of sources and to be able to record, organise, summarise, and integrate information. All of these definitions and the diagram can be found on the NCCA website. When teaching Bismarck's foreign policy, I could be faced with a number of difficulties. The first difficulty could be keeping students engaged. With all the key persons and key dates, both in English and German, it may be hard to keep students engaged. The second difficulty I could be faced with is the jump from junior certificate to leaving certificates in relation to thinking and learning. It is evident that there is a big jump between these cycles, and 50 years is the time to settle into a new way of thinking. The third and final difficulty I could be faced with as a history teacher is helping my students formulate an essay with the most relevant information. As I previously said, my students are faced with a big jump between the cycles, and it might take a while for them to settle into the new way of thinking and also the new way of writing and formulating essays. With Bismarck's foreign policy, it is possible to make cross-curricular links between the 2 other humanities subjects, which are geography and CSPE. With geography, we would study the maps to witness Germany's unification and reform and to see where Bismarck colonised in the scramble for Africa. In CSPE, we would be looking at Bismarck's diplomacy through the Balkan Crisis and the Reassurance Treaty of 1887. In conclusion, I believe that throughout my research, I have gained a deeper understanding and a stronger knowledge of Bismarck's foreign policy. Throughout this presentation, I have outlined the following. Firstly, I established that Bismarck's foreign policy is a historical issue that falls under the humanities subject. I then outlined the learning outcomes which would have been achieved when the topic would have been completed. I then addressed the difficulties that students could have in regards to grasping this topic, and I later addressed the difficulties teachers could have when teaching this topic. I then went through the plan I would have for the introductory lesson, which brings us through the beginning, the middle, and the end of the lesson. I then went through various teaching, learning, and assessment strategies that I would use when teaching, and the 3 key skills that I would want my students to develop. I finally looked at the cross-curricular links to Bismarck's foreign policy. Here I have put the references I used throughout the presentation, which can be found also in the bio below. Thank you very much for your interest and attention.